When you can't find the CS, it's important to recognize that there may be CS atresia. And if you have CS atresia, it's very possible that the patient will have a persistent vein of Marshall through which you can implant. So here we have a case where it was difficult to find the CS. And so by looking with a vein selector along the subclavian vein right at the clavicular sternal junction, we found a persistent vein of Marshall. Patients with CS atresia frequently have a persistent vein of Marshall which enters the subclavian at the sternoclavicular junction. And so in this case, simply by dragging the vein selector along, we were able to find the vein of Marshall. We were able to then wire the vein of Marshall, and we did a venogram of the coronary sinus. Now the size of this persistent vein of Marshall is determined by blood flow. The more complete the CS atresia, then the larger the vein of Marshall. So some patients will have CS atresia that's incomplete, and so there'll be a fair amount of blood flow exiting into the right atrium, and thus the vein of Marshall will be smaller. In other situations, there can be an unroofed coronary sinus, in which case the blood flow from the coronary sinus enters into the left atrium, and again, because not all the blood goes up the vein of Marshall, the size of the vein of Marshall is smaller. In this case, we had pretty much complete occlusion of the CS, so pretty much complete CS atresia, and so the vein of Marshall was fairly large and relatively easy to find with the vein selector. At this point, you're probably thinking about the embryology, and yes, the embryology of CS atresia with a persistent vein of Marshall is related to persistent left SVC, but remember the direction of blood flow is in the opposite direction, and you encounter this persistent vein of Marshall not because that's the only place the catheter will go, but because you can't find the CS. So they're very, very, very different in terms of how they present clinically. And so in this case, we're able to advance the vein selector down the persistent vein of Marshall, and we have the 5.5 French LVI deep in the branch, providing support, and we're able to place the LV lead firmly in this posterolateral branch, and then remove the sheath. Now, as the sheath is removed, you want to put as much slack into the coronary sinus as possible to accommodate for any respiratory fluctuations and loss of slack. If you can't find the persistent vein of Marshall using a vein selector, then the presence and location can be established with a leave-of-phase coronary injection, as in this case, which is another case of this anomaly that we saw recently. And you can see here, you inject the coronary artery, the leave-of-phase of the injection is followed, and you can say here's the CS filling, and rather than focusing down here on where the CS empties, it's important to look for this persistent vein of Marshall, and then you'll know where to look for it off the left subclavian, and then you can implant down this persistent vein of Marshall. I hope you find this helpful.